our next panel is going to be about climate change and capitalism, which is something, again, that is directly related to this like larger issue. Before we move on to the next panel, we have a couple of announcements to make. And a big announcement that one other student is going to make about the tuition strike and the divestment is going to come up in just a second. But before we get to this announcement, I'd just like to say that we have some links that Emmeline is going to drop into the chat on ways in which you can support the tuition strike. The tuition strike has already begun to win important victories, but it's important that we continue to keep this pressure up because students at Columbia have real momentum right now and we want to continue to capitalize on this. So we have a letter campaign in support of the strike. You can send letters just with the push of one button. We're hoping to have people join more student movements, so not just YDSA, but also SJP, different student groups. One of the great things about organizing is that we've had 150 new people in the last month volunteer to join YDSA because they've been inspired by our organizing. And so this is something that you can take this organizing efforts and use it to inform the next generation, which is really important to us. And finally, we have some different petitions from different student groups, specifically Mobilize African Diaspora, one of the coalition partners for YDSA, specifically about the treatment of Black students and the surrounding students in Harlem. And so these are going to be put into the chat. And then we are going to make a brief announcement of some really exciting news that was just announced about an hour ago about divestment. We have today one of the students who inspired this tuition strike at Columbia with her role in the hunger strike that took place. Savannah Pearson is going to speak about the announcement of divestment from fossil fuels at Columbia. Thank you, Savannah, for being here.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, so I don't know if you heard, but about an hour ago, we actually got a very exciting announcement, which was that as of an hour ago, Columbia University is fully divested from the fossil fuel industry. So Willem asked me to come speak about sort of the state of divestment and where it stands for this panel, but the good news is that, yeah, divestment just happened about an hour ago, so we're very excited. People on campus have been working towards divestment for years and years and years. Columbia Divest was a group that organized for about 5 years or so, and they staged a sit-in that lasted multiple days in the library. And Sunrise also has been organizing the past years with us. And so we're just really grateful. We're really grateful to YDSA for including divestment as one of their demands for this tuition strike. And you can see that the strike is already having its effect and making change. So yeah, we're just really grateful to YDSA, and we're looking forward to seeing what more changes are made thanks to the strike. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Savannah, for joining us today. And as on the topic of divestment, and with this exciting news of Columbia's announcement to divest from fossil fuels, we have this great panel lined up before us to talk about climate change, talk about divestment, and talk about how climate change and the fight for climate change is linked to a much larger struggle against capitalism and the ways in which climate change affects the most vulnerable people in unequal ways. We have a really great panel here today. We have Chase Iron Eyes from the Lakota Law Project. Mr. Iron Eyes has been influential in organizing against the Keystone Pipeline, and we're really excited to have him here today. Ajay Singh Chaudhary, the founder of the Brooklyn Institute, is also here today to speak. We also have Jo Guldi, who is a professor at SMU, as well as Alyssa Battistoni. Alyssa is the co-author, along with Thea Ria Francos, Daniel Odeya Cohen, and Kate Arnoff, of A Planet to Win, a book about the case for the Green New Deal. So we're really excited for the panelists here today, especially with this really exciting timing of the announcement for divestment from Columbia. Before we start, I'm just going to put into the chat the announcement that we just put out for Columbia YDSA. Actually, I can do this at the end of the panel, but we just put an announcement about the divestment at Columbia. That'd be great if everyone could share. But yeah, before we, I guess, with all of that behind us, I would really like to get started on this panel. And we are going to start with one question for each of the panelists before opening it up to the audience and letting the panelists respond to each other. And so to start off with, we're going to ask Chase Iron Eyes. And this question is, how did the consequences of the climate crisis unequally affect minority groups in the United States? And what is the role of direct action in combating this inequality?
Thank you. Thank you for that. And congratulations on all the organizing work that is going on right now. As you may or may not know, I'm sure a lot of you do, just 4 years ago, when thinking about how the human-caused climate collapse or financial extractive induced ecological collapse, how does that disproportionately impact indigenous nations who, were here for a very long time. We don't know how long, but we signed treaties with a fledgling United States of America, and we recognized a foreign presence. The right of foreigners to be in our homelands was recognized through internationally binding treaties. So when the Dakota Access Pipeline, now this was 4 years ago, and it's just right around the same time that Trump took office, which seems like some long drawn out dream or nightmare or whatever, that it just ended. And in this, line of work, in this place where it's not just indigenous nations that are born into struggle anymore. Every single person that is alive right now is born into this struggle to deconstruct this set of circumstances that has given us a shelf life, and it is causing us to behave like a virus. But in terms of that big financial extractive complex instigating against all of our people and those elements that were here before us, indigenous nations are a lot of the times kind of just expected or forced to live in the sacrifice zones of these projects. And that goes for disempowered people, marginalized people, working class people. We are called to protect Mother Earth, because a lot of times this comes right through our treaty territories, right through our homelands, and it caused myself and 850 others to cross that line of civil resistance, to make ourselves arrestable, to become part of that frontline sacrifice. And we were about to do it again with the Keystone XL pipeline, but fortunately, President Biden kept his promise, and we are currently asking for help to shift attention to a project called Line 3, another tar sands project. You can Google that or check it out on Twitter, Line 3. And above the border, the Tiny House Warriors are in a fight for their lives with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And additionally, we've got a gentleman named Oscar Hyelt, who's facing 23 years in prison for Keystone XL pipeline resistance. Another young lady named Jacelyn Charger. And so these struggles will continue. They will continue to escalate. There's no sitting this out. There's no such thing as sidelining ourselves or sitting on the bench while this fight is happening. But in the meantime, I know that everybody's just trying to make it through school. And so the climate extractive fight and that struggle and that crisis is connected just as much to student loan debt relief. I, for one, am completely saddled with student debt. It's akin to the fight for an increased minimum wage. It's akin to the fight for Medicare for all. It's all connected. All of our struggles are connected. And I really just thank you for hosting this panel and this session. And once again, I congratulate you on your forward movement. This is a lifelong process. It's a struggle, yes, but that doesn't mean we can't celebrate. That doesn't mean we can't smile. Doesn't mean we can't be happy. But we are also very cognizant of that challenge that is presented by those forces which seek to continue to colonize our spaces. And that includes usurping our sacred understanding of our place in this universe. That is a fight that we have to show up for every single day. So once again, thank you, and thank you for your continued support.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all your work. I think that for all of us, the Indigenous struggle against the pipelines was honestly a turning point and an inspiration point for me and for climate change organizers across the country. And so thank you so much for being here. I was really excited when you let us know that you could be on this panel. And next up, we're going to go to Ajay. And Ajay, when writing about the climate crisis, what do you mean when you say, we are not in this together? And how will people outside of the United States also be unequally impacted by climate change?
Thank you. It's a great question. The first thing I want to say, though, as every time I'm invited back in any capacity to speak at Columbia University, I always like to point out that Columbia University and institutions like it are essentially tax-free hedge funds. That is their basic function in society. And to reproduce, it was talked about in the last panel, to sort of reproduce a certain kind of person, but basically tax-free hedge funds. And without being too reductive, the greatest power that capital has is the power over the decision on investment. So I can't emphasize enough actually how important this sort of, even what might seem like a very small or narrow victory is in terms of limiting what is essentially a financial institution's power that you all have achieved, right? To make investment decisions. So I just want to say, like, utterly underline what I think Savannah just inserted there very quickly, that is actually a very important and very powerful thing that y'all have done. So to answer your actual question, when I say, so I've written about this, and I'm currently writing about this in a much greater length in a manuscript. When I say we're not in this together, I think that there's a sort of very common misunderstanding about climate. That it's sort of like apocalyptic, and B, that there aren't sort of really competing interests that are both kind of actually weirdly rational. And so what do I mean by not apocalyptic? At some degree, it is in fact absolutely apocalyptic. And we're actually seeing the play out of that in many ways as you know, in real time. But there are different groups of people who would be more than thrilled to live in a like change of 3 degrees world or so, a change of 3.5. And you actually see people writing about this pretty openly. That's discussed pretty commonly, for example, in like discount rate debates and stuff. Like that is like very normal. And yet you have this idea, I think in the piece you're referencing, I can't remember every bit that's in there, but I can think of like pretty wonderful people on the left who I really like respect their work, like someone like Ellen Meiskin Wood. Like had written an article about climate like back in the 90s, I think, that was like, oh, this is too universal for you to develop a politics around it, because basically it affects everyone equally, and capital's going to have to do something about it. And then Deepesh Chakrabarti is, I think, probably more contemporary people probably know his work. It made a similar thing. It's like, oh, this is the thing that finally is going to make everyone have to act together universally, because, you know, we all have the same interests. and I can go on and on. As I said, it's there in the mainstream debates. And I think it's there in a lot of the very sort of, even very well-meaning, and I sort of mean this in the bottom of my heart, like very well-meaning, like liberal commentaries, where it's like, oh, like we're going to reach a tipping point. Guys, we're just there. We're at this tipping point where like it's going to hurt everyone more than it helps. And so we're all going to like decide, but we're not. Like, that's the thing. Like, I feel like we're at a tipping point. The people of Micronesia feel like they're at a tipping point. You know, like much of Central Asia, like, is not going to be livable and pretty soon. Like the southern half of India is not going to do so hot. Like there's like a huge swath of the world, and to pick up on something that Chase said, right? Like there are colonized spaces we also want to think about domestically, in addition to internationally, right? So this is a transnational phenomenon, where like that urgency is right the fuck now. And for other people, it's like, no, yeah, we do have to deal with this, but like, it's okay if we deal with it by 2060. And like, if we do change a little bit. And this is the sort of groundwork, I think, the basic fundamental groundwork for a political conflict. These are fundamentally irreconcilable differences. They are not, there's no happy medium between them. So it must be fought out on these terms. And I think it's very hard for a lot of folks, for ideological reasons, but also for very good ones, even for some of my really close colleagues in the natural sciences, for example, who I'm always like trying to get my fellow like political theorists and social scientists to be like, read more natural science. But then I want to like shake my science friends and be like, no, guys, that's not how politics work. It's not just like, we'll give them just one more raft of facts and they're gonna be like, oh, okay. Like, so this I think is very vital. Seeing how we are not in this together is really vital in order to understand this as a political struggle. And I also think, you know, I wrote that piece before the pandemic, but I also think the pandemic and the experience of it has just highlighted how much reality there is to that. Like literally every fucking commercial, every statement from a government official was like, oh, we're all in this together. But like, you can clearly see this like radical divergence of experiences between different groups. So I think that answers the question, I hope.
For sure. Yeah, it's something that I think that is an important debate on the left. And I'm glad that you brought in the response to COVID, is communication on issues like climate change or COVID. And you mentioned Dipesh Chakrabarti, also, you know, William McNeill, or like the ideas of big history, and that if you convince humans that they're all part of this larger struggle, then you might be able to galvanize them into working together. But, you know, as we saw with something like COVID, if we are not in this together, then if you have rich people that can escape to their second homes in Whitefish, Montana, or Jackson Hole, Wyoming, then you don't have the urgency. And so if you ignore this like dialectic, it comes at the expense of the people that are most vulnerable and the essential workers that are forced to be exposed. So yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation throughout the panel. But next, I'd like to go to Alyssa Battistoni and talk more a little bit about the Green New Deal and bring the focus back to the United States. And so much of the Green New Deal, at least what people think about it, is focused on achieving a just climate transition within the United States. But in A Planet to Win, you and the other authors also write about supply chain justice. So how can climate policy in countries like the United States ensure climate justice both for vulnerable Americans and people affected in other countries?
Hi, first of all, thanks for just inviting me to be here. It's really, the tuition check is really great. And it's so terrific to hear that you've already won a big victory on divestment. Congratulations. So yeah, I think the question is a really interesting one. And I'll say what we try to do in A Planet to Win, our book on the Green New Deal, which is sort of a vision of a radical Green New Deal, and trying to push sort of like what a left version of the Green New Deal is, since we have a lot of different, I think, visions of what the Green New Deal could be floating around. But what we really, I think, try to do is reframe the question of the global a little bit, or the relationship of the US to the global. Because as you say, the Green New Deal usually is treated as a domestic policy. And certainly I think that one of the major things the US can do for global climate justice is just to reduce emissions within the US and to stop extracting and selling and exporting or using internally fossil fuels, because the US is a major fossil fuel producer. So I think, certainly there are a lot of I think obvious things that we know the U.S. can do, and that U.S. action contributes to global climate justice. That's always there. But we also try to look at the ways in which domestic policy is also, has an international component, has a global component, and what the green transition, the sort of international and global effects of that are. So rather than, usually when we talk about the global with respect to climate change, it's in the kind of, we talk about like the UN and global climate talks and these spaces where kind of, in a way, I think reflect what Ajay has just been talking about, where like the whole world comes together to like hash out like a climate solution or something. Those I think have not been terribly effective so far. But we try to shift focus actually instead to another way that the world is connected, and that's through the supply chains of global capital and the trade networks of global capitalism, and to look specifically at the supply chains of the green transition. So what that means is we're starting to look, we look at the places where, where we get the minerals and other resources that go into green and renewable energy technology specifically, so cobalt and copper and lithium and nickel and rare earth minerals. And in particular, we look at Chile, where the lithium for batteries used for storing renewable energy is mined, and about 15% of lithium reserves globally are found in Chile. Presently about 30% of lithium that's produced is mined in Chile. And that has, like other forms of extraction, has local social and environmental impacts. Lithium's mined from the salt flats, the Andean salt flats, the Salar de Atacama, which is a very dry region. So there's a problem potentially with mining affecting with the water supply. And it's been protested and resisted by local communities, and particularly local indigenous communities. And so we think that we have to take all of that into account when we're thinking about the green transition, and not just sort of ignore the fact that like what we call green technologies also have their own environmental impacts, that there are, that is, it might be green in the sense of like lower carbon or reducing carbon emissions, but that doesn't mean that we just go and like, dig up the whole world to make into batteries to power SUVs in the US. So the point for the Green New Deal is there's, I think, a couple of ways that we could think about bringing that into like domestic policy like the Green New Deal. And one is that I think it really matters not just whether we achieve some kind of like transition away from fossil fuels, but how. And so if we transition away from fossil fuels by just like replacing every petroleum fueled car with an electric vehicle, so like everyone just has like their own private electric car, that's a much more resource intensive form of transition than if we start, say, moving away from like a car oriented model of transportation towards public transportation. And that same point holds for a lot of other kinds of like individual versus collective forms of consumption and goods. The more that we can consume collectively, the less resource intensive that consumption is. And that means, if we're talking about building like electric buses rather than everyone having an electric SUV, that's a really big difference in terms of like what kinds of demands for things like lithium we're making, and what the sort of repercussions of that are for the places where that lithium is being extracted and obtained. So we want to lighten in general that, the sort of how heavily our demand is, that also frees up, like we are going to be extracting some amount of minerals, but we want some of that to be available for not just the U.S., like for the U.S. to hog sort of all of the, or to use like a huge amount of these resources for like our own energy transition. I think is also a problem we want. To the extent that we are using things like lithium, that should be available to other countries that also need to, to use renewable technologies. So, and I should say, that's actually a place, something like the public goods provision is someplace where we really, there is like, I think a real like an overlap between how we can address like this problem of supply chain justice and just transition in the US, because, if we expand things like public transportation, other public goods and services, and these forms of like collective consumption, that is a way of, that addresses people's needs here in the US. That is a way of meeting needs of vulnerable Americans for, things like, how do you get around? You still need to get around. So I think that can really, there are places like that where you can kind of, to reduce resource use doesn't have to mean that you like just, that people here aren't able to do, again, things they need to do, like get from one place to another. But we also really want to focus on the importance of, the piece I mentioned about trade and how to focus on, setting new labor and environmental standards in the trade policies that govern how these, these resources and goods move around the world. And right now, trade rules are generally written by and for capital to ease the, the movement of capital. They're written by, as Ajay said, capital controls investment decisions and also generally controls the rules about how those investment decisions are made and how, how and where investment happens and the structure of sort of the circulation of the goods produced by that investment. So that, we have a global system of trade, basically, I think organized by capital. So far, the right has really been at the forefront of challenges to that system. There's been obviously a lot of sort of rhetoric against like globalism and free trade and all of that from the right. There obviously is a history of that on the left too, with like the alter globalization movement and so on. But we want to, we are for thinking about how do we bring some of those those ideas and that history into the present, and thinking about how can we like make a trade policy where things like that prioritizes human and labor rights and environmental protections. How can we organize around and for that? And I think some of the I think something like both thinking how can we organize like along the supply chain so that, maybe people, communities affected by mining in Chile and like Tesla workers at the factory in California are both part of the same supply chain for the green technologies and the green transition. How can we think about connecting those dots some more? And I think this is someplace where things like, the kinds of direct action that Chase was talking about is a really important component. Obviously, it's been very effective in stopping the circulation of fossil fuels like oil and gas. But I think it can also be a powerful tool for things, like lithium mining, for example, is really concentrated in a few areas. So that kind of like makes it vulnerable to, these bottlenecks basically, and that makes it really vulnerable to disruption. So like if you can organize disruptions of that supply chain, maybe you can have more power and say like, okay, you have to, we need protections to be in place around how this is for workers, for the local environment, and so on. And that can put more power into the hands of labor, environment, indigenous groups. So I'll stop there, but yeah, that's the basic idea. How can we think a little bit differently about like what that global piece of the climate picture is, and how things like the Green New Deal are always global, even if we're talking domestically.
Yeah, that was so informative. Thank you so much. I want to return to the question after we hear from Jo Guldi, I want to return to this idea of an international approach to climate change. But before we move there, I would just like to ask for our last question for Jo, what historical precedents should we know about tackling problems of the international scale of climate change?
Thanks, Willem, and congratulations again on this wonderful achievement. And so I want my answer to kind of weave together. Chase, Iron Eyes, and Ajay were talking about the power of the people. And Alyssa kind of took us on a journey into international relations, policy, and trade, and two very different levels of change. And I want to kind of connect those two using a story about freedom, on international freedom, land and water, that you might not know. There are lots of stories in the longue durée about capitalism and its relationship to the environment. And there are some great people probably teaching in this at other times who can tell you that story about how bound up with capitalism and Western empire the history of the climate tragedy is. But I want to look back into history and see if I can fish out for you some freedom songs. So the success of blocking the Keystone Pipeline is a freedom song. The civil rights movement was a freedom song. But I want to think about an even bigger freedom song. It might not be on your horizon. I want to make some connections for you. And that's a story of struggles for control over land and water in the moment of decolonization. So the story that I'm going to tell you begins in 19th century India and Ireland, two different parts of British Empire, connected by a history of exploitation. These are two parts of the world where people have been victimized by land theft, displacement, slavery, and genocide. And they've been rebelling by putting the only thing they have left on the line, which is their bodies. And they're refusing to work, going on strikes, refusing to pay the rent, staging mass meetings and marches. So what this phenomenon is called in the 1880s, the land war. And British administrators see the land war happening at the same time in India and in Bengal. The same people using the same tactics, in part because they're meeting in London, and they're actually Roman Catholic Irish and Bengalis, radical Bengalis, are sharing tactics. They're talking about a rent strike. What happens if we just stop paying rent to the landlords? The land war is successful. They declare a land war against the crime of colonial theft of land. A land war can only be solved, not by piecemeal negotiations, not by suspending habeas corpus, not by punishing people. The only way you win a land war is by winning the land. So what they're saying is we need reparations. We need native peoples of India and Ireland. We need the land back. And they're talking about actual land theft, right? So in 1881, they're successful, at least piecemeal successful in Ireland. 1881 is the story of the first land redistribution measure in modern world history, the Land Act of Ireland. It's the story of 1881 is the date of the first modern Rent Control Act. And Ireland gets it. India nominally gets it in 1886, but it's not enforced. Scotland nominally gets it, but it's not enforced. The displacements, they never get their land back. But in Ireland gets it. Ireland, the peasants get the land. The landlords are bought out by the state. They're paid off, and the land returns to Irish smallholders. And this moment opens up a new period of history, global period of struggle of native peoples for control over their territory, which is the moment that we know is decolonization. And it's often talked about in terms of race and ethnicity, and there's certainly truth in that, a story about identity, but it also took the form in many, many places of struggles over rent, not paying rent to absentee landlords, and the ownership of local people of the land, and the conditions for sustainably living there without paying rent that keeps on going up and up and up. It takes the form of natural resource localization so that the people of the nation own the ore underneath the surface. They own the water. All of that is going to be taken back from European colonization. So famously, there's the Mexican Revolution, then there's India, and then there's virtually every nation in Latin America and Africa and South Asia, Southeast Asia, and land reform, some form of land reform or other, is typical of almost every one of those revolutions from 1880 all the way through the 1970s. They're coordinated, they're international, they're sharing tactics. And for a period of time, those decolonial movements and their ambitions of giving land over to small farmers are coordinated by a body of academics, social scientists, economists working for the United Nations, the arm of the United Nations known as the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is a form of international government built in the service of the peasants. It's a contentious remark. Parts of the United Nations were definitely not. That arm was. And they continue to advise member nations, decolonial nations, about how to effectively, economically support agriculture by the poorest of the poor until 1974, when there's an American coup at the World Bank that wrests back control of the United Nations by snatching the purse strings. And that coup needs to be understood in the context of what's happening in America at the same time. What's happening in America in the 1970s is Black agricultural cooperatives claiming the land as reparations for 40 acres and a mule. That never happens. Native peoples movements claiming the land, invading Alcatraz, squatting in upstate New York, refusing to move. And what do you think McNamara, who's fighting in Vietnam and is then in charge of the World Bank, thinks of all of this? He thinks they're coming for our land, for white America's land. We have to stop this. You stop it by cutting off the FAO. So there are many stories in the 20th century about how social science has been used in the service of empire. There are many stories about how agricultural science has been used in the service of empire, but we have not heard the story about how all of those forms of science can serve the peasant, can serve the indigenous, can serve land redistribution, and effectively economically holding on to the means of manufacture, agriculture, sustainable livelihoods. We need that kind of international vision again. There are many wonderful piecemeal and decentralized initiatives going on right now to do land redistribution in the United States, focused on North America. And I encourage you to look into them and to support them. Initiatives like Minnow, which is raising philanthropic funds to give over farms to people of color and to Native people. The Agrarian Trust, which is trying to sponsor small, decentralized organic farming. They're wonderful. But we need an international vision. We need a vision of scale that can weave agriculture and livelihoods and rights to land and water, clean, healthy land and water for the people, by the people, at an international level, making common cause of all of these Native people's land claims. So I encourage you, students at Columbia, take history classes. You have some of the best historians of international relationships and international governance at your university. Susan Peterson is the historian of the League of Nations. Mark Mazauer is the historian of the UN. Ask them questions about what went wrong. Ask them questions about what could go right. And think big, dare to think big on behalf of all of these people's movements, to give them the rights to land and water that they deserve and that history says they have claimed in the past.
Wow, yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists. And we're definitely running a little bit short on time, especially for such a difficult follow-up question. But I would like to ask, this kind of relates, and something I've been thinking about. Alyssa, you mentioned copper in Chile. This is something that is very interesting to me. I'm from Montana, and there's a long history of copper mining in Montana. And one thing that is interesting about this shift for climate change is that if we are going to successfully convert to renewable energy, there's going to be an increase in copper demand by 150%. And so as you have this increased copper usage, there's pushback in places like Montana, in places like Alaska, against these new copper mines, which target resources that Americans value, such as rivers and fishing. But if you have successful environmental resistance in Montana, in Alaska to these copper mines, the copper still has to come from somewhere. And so you're pushing the copper mining away from the United States, but you're pushing it somewhere else, like you talked about with the supply chains. And so Ajay, you tweeted the other day about how global North industrial unions are never going to be in the vanguard because you have these American unions that don't have the same values as the rest of the world. And so I would like each of the panelists to just very briefly, and we can go in the same order we started with, to answer, is it possible for the United States to be a zone of climate resistance, or because of the United States colonial past and because of the way that it exists as this hegemon, are we unable to lead on something like climate change because of our position of global dominance? And so Chase Iron Eyes, if we could start with you. It looks like Chase might be frozen. While we wait for him, if Ajay, you'd like to speak just for a couple minutes on this question.
You picked out probably my most controversial position. Okay, can the U.S. be a leader? Okay, so I think there's 2 or 3 ways, and I really want to thank everyone else. It's nice to see you, Alyssa, too, by the way. I thought everyone's has put so much on the table, and it's all really very, very brilliant. And I was so glad that Alyssa sort of put the supply chains and how this shit actually works, on the table. And Jo was really putting empire and the history of anti-colonial movements and struggles. This stuff is so relevant. And when I think about something, I think we have to first think about where there are, in fact, very, very powerful climate movements already in the world. They are more prolific in a lot of, frankly, more peasant-driven places. And in the global South, more broadly speaking, there is much more oomph in a sort of towards a green politics, a real green politics, what I would say. When I'm thinking about the U.S., and I think this touches on some of the things that Alyssa was mentioning, I think there are things that can happen, right? Very small things can make a big difference. For example, if the U.S. stopped enforcing international IP law, this would be a tremendous boon to global green transformations. At the same time, what you just mentioned, Willem, well, it's got to go somewhere, is both true and also indicative of a problem that I think a lot of people like to avoid, which is that there's no way, global, we're in basically a post-growth era. So growth-based solutions, things like that are essentially done. This is sometimes, I think, missed in the we are growth, we are anti-growth debate. So it's going to have to just be different. In places like the U.S. And when if there was popular sovereignty, in a place I don't know, fucking Congo, if a U.S. empire was not constantly stoking conflict in a place like that, the price of their lithium would shoot through the roof. Right? These kinds of things are really vital. And I'm sorry to say this because I know this is a deeply felt like position on many parts of the contemporary left. And I'm literally saying it during a fucking strike. But like this sort of very simplistic model of like, you unionize the workers and then we are all workers and then we all blah, blah, like read like Adam Jaworski's like Social Democracy and Capitalism. Like this has never worked. This was never the sort of Marxist theory of change. This has historically not been how revolution. I'm so glad Joe like sort of pointed it out. This is like not the way change has normally actually happened. This has theoretical limitations. This also has historical problems. And when so often people are like, oh, I want to, no, I want to redefine the definition of the working class. And it's actually going to be this much more broad thing. And we're going to talk about unwaged work and care work. And we're really going to break through the racial and gender divisions that somehow they always end up talking about like industrial workers in manufacturing plants. And it's like, that is like, I think maybe 7% of the US workforce at this point. And it's like, oh, we're going to get them on board. Well, you're not. I'm sorry, like in the current configuration, and this is making me sound like I'm a Marcuse in like 1974, but like they are closer to like they're more likely to go with the haute bourgeoisie than they are likely to be like, I want popular sovereignty for the people of Congo. Like, because it will in fact mark a decrease in their standard of living as measured today. Although I would argue that I don't think this is a necessarily like regressive thing, and I don't think this is about the working class. I like fucking hate those kinds of like people are dumb kind of arguments. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. That's a bad word to use there. But like, it's not like it's a completely lost cause, but I think people want it to be the vanguard for arguments that are like a century dated. And we really have to think along, I think precisely, I'm so happy that Joe raised this, like along the models of like the anti-colonial movements, which in addition to all the tactics that Joe listed there, I will just to triple down on the controversialness of this, point out all, even in India, all used political violence to achieve parts of their ends.
Awesome. Yeah, so that's, if anyone wants to end on like a more uplifting American Union note, Ajay's definitely correct on a lot of these points. But if anyone else has a alternate take on this, Alyssa, Joe, or if Chase wants to come back in.
I just want to say I am pro-union. Everyone deserves a union.
No, but it is a really good point. It's something that I've thought a lot about as well. Is like, what is the place of the United States or places like the United States in this larger international movement for like climate equality? So Alyssa, Joe, sorry, we're running pretty short on time, but anyone else?
But it'll have greater dramatic effect if I try to defend the United States after everyone attacks it. Do you want to go for all the attacks?
I don't know if we have. Alyssa, what would you like to add?
Well, I'll add my piece and then Joe can sort of take it however you will. So I guess I'll say I agree with a huge amount that Ajay says. In fact, I would say I probably agree with all of it, but I also think that we have to figure out, like, the US is not leading. It's not going to lead. It's way too late. The ship has sailed on leading, no matter how much, Joe Biden or any of our other political figures talk about like the US time to lead, blah, blah, like we're way behind. We're like at the back of the pack, which is like what you would expect, right? Like for all of the reasons that you, Willem, and Ajay have just laid out. That said, right now there are not many mechanisms by which people who are leading climate movements in other countries are able to sort of enforce any of that on the US, both because of lack of sovereignty over their own countries, but also certainly like there's not any way there's no like global sovereignty. There's no sort of way to restrict US like carbon emissions in the name of the global good. So like it or not, we have to figure out some ways that a country in which many people are not naturally positioned, I guess, naturally is a bad word, whatever, but like, are not sort of like positioned to be in a like climate vanguard and are not the climate vanguard. But we still have to, I think, figure out how we can like have a force of for climate action, and I would say like a popular force for climate action. And that's a lot of what we try to do with the Green New Deal idea, which like I think has runs into limitations along exactly sort of these these lines. But also, I think is practically speaking, in terms of cutting emissions here, but also things like, you talked, Willem, about things like copper mining in Montana, and obviously the US is like the site of a lot of extraction still, but also we're going to need to build out a lot of of energy production, like wind and solar and so on. I guess you could think of that as like a form of like extraction of solar and wind resources. But in any case, it is going to be an imposition on communities that currently don't have that kind of production, like industrial production of energy taking place, that will have, potentially challenges for things like water and air and so on. So I think there's less air, more maybe water or landscape or whatever. Anyway, the point is, I think we're going to see the same kinds of these are real challenges that are going to be emerging in a lot of places, and I think we really do have to take that very seriously. But I also think that this is another place where I guess I would want to disaggregate the ways that people sometimes people's interests do and don't align with those of capital, and resistance to the thing itself versus a company coming in and saying, we're going to do this here, we're doing it the cheapest and shittiest way that will make the most money, versus I think there are sometimes things that people don't necessarily want. People may not want a windmill, but they're really not going to want it if you just don't consult them about where it goes. They don't get any of the money that is being taken in from it. It has no benefits for people living there, and only harms. If you're extracting lithium or copper and paying very, very low wages to workers, giving the country where it's extracted very low share of that resource and so on, whatever. So there's a lot of different things that I think factor into those, and that goes through unions too. I guess I would say on the union piece, unions are not in the vanguard of climate action necessarily. Unions are really different, but also labor protections and environmental protections are often posed as opposites, but they go together. When companies have the power to override worker protections, or where there aren't unions, they usually also, there are very little in the way of environmental protections. Basically resistance to capital and capital doing whatever it wants, I think, is much more aligned across environment and labor than it's usually made out to be. So that may not appear as such. People will still be oh, the pipeline is costing jobs, or sort of the cancellation of the pipeline costs jobs and so on. But we actually need to think about, I think, try to be really explicit about look, capital is, when capital can do what it wants, it's bad for labor, it's bad for everyone else, it's bad for nature, it's bad for it's bad for anyone that comes into conflict with the interests of capital. So I will just leave it at that.
For sure. No, and this is actually a great segue. And I'm going to let Jo give the final word, but I'd like to also introduce the people coming in to watch our next panel, which is going to be on organizing. We have a fantastic panel of organizers who are going to speak about the importance of organizing and hopefully touch on some of these questions as well. Thank you so much for everyone that's tuning in now for that panel. But I would like to give the final word to Jo Guldi to defend the United States and its role in the taking on climate change. And also just thank you everyone for being here. This panel, I've been looking forward to it all week, and it's been fantastic. So thank you.
Thanks, Willem, again. And I'm just going to run further in the direction that Alyssa sketched out. People in South Dallas, where I live, know that their landscape has been poisoned. They mistrust the public water in the schools. Many of them are sick all the time, and that's made them into great organizers. People in Houston know that their houses are being poisoned because big oil put stuff in the ground years ago, and they're not taking responsibility. And they've tried reaching out to the EPA, and they know that the EPA has been declawed, and the whole process is corrupt. So they know, and they are wonderful organizers. They are wonderful organizers who need more tools. They need tools to map their neighborhoods. They need tools to track what is and isn't being said in their legislature, their city council and the state legislature. They need people who have text mining skills to keep a constant eye watching people who are in power. That's what we all need. And that's something that people with Ivy League education and skills can provide. And so for the big difference of what America can do, I think Alyssa is spot on, that people care about being inhabitants. It might not be and Ajay is right, we're not going to organize people like we were in the 19th century around membership in a guild. Like, that world is gone. But you can organize people around being inhabitants of a neighborhood. They want to be safe. They want their kids to be safe. You can organize them around being tenants or having an affordable place to live. All of that is a big issue. Famously, the United States of America didn't have a revolution because it had land for many people, mobilized through the Homestead Act, which was a radical act if you were a white settler, and then through the GI Act, which was a radical act if you were white and working class and typically male. But those gave land and housing and safe housing to a lot of people. And we've seen that politics even in the last 5 years. Nobody was talking about halting evictions until Matt Desmond's book Evicted came out. And now not only Biden, but Trump had no problem putting into place an eviction moratorium, because they knew, could you imagine the outrage, unemployment and rent checks going through the ceiling? That is something, the will of inhabitants, people as inhabitants, as occupants, that's something to mobilize. It's something to work with. I just want to commend my fellow panelists for being so spot on, and to thank Willem. It's an honor to join you. I want to thank all of the students who have been here, and say good work, everybody, and good luck to the next panelists. We'll check you out later.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm looking forward to following up. But before everyone leaves, if everyone could please share our most recent tweet that I put in the chat on Twitter about the divestment decision at Columbia. This is huge news for us, and it's really important that we use this moment at Columbia to inspire further direct action across the country. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Emmeline in our next fantastic panel that I've been looking forward to as well. I encourage people who stayed for the climate change panel to stay on for this next panel about organizing, and I'll give it to Emmeline from here.
I was muted. Thank you all so much for coming. So really quickly before we transition, just wanted to again make some quick announcements, other steps that you can take. We're doing a letter campaign in support of the strike. It's really easy, just takes a second to send letters in support of the strike to the administration. We also have a strike fund to offset potential late fees, and also really want to encourage everyone to join DSA or YDSA if you're a student, and also to sign up for our YDSA Winter Conference at the end of February. We're also having a panel on student debt cancellation on February 5th, as well as to sign the petition of our coalition partner, Mobilize African Diaspora. And all of those links are on this slide, and I'll drop them in the chat later.